If your surname is on this list, you're not just Canadian by birth. You are carrying something your family never fully explained to you. A secret, a scandal, or a debt that was buried on purpose generation after generation until nobody left alive could tell you the truth. 17 surnames, 17 families, 17 stories that Canadian parents used to lower their voices to tell if they told them at all. Some of these names were tied to disasters nobody wanted remembered. Some were tied to betrayals inside their own communities. And at least one of them is connected to a scandal that still shapes how an entire province sees itself today. A few of these families were split apart so completely that separate branches don't even know the others exist anymore, scattered across provinces that used to be a single household. Stay until the end, because number 4 is the one that split a whole town in half. And number 11 might be the coldest story on this entire list. Before we go further, if your surname shows up today, don't scroll past it. Type it in the comments the second you hear it, because I read every single one. And I want to know how many of you are about to find out something about your own family that nobody ever sat you down to explain. And if you're new here, hit subscribe now, because next week's video is going to expose the surnames tied to Canada's darkest logging camps, and you will not want to miss it. All right, let's begin. Before we get into the list, you need to understand something about Canadian surnames that most people never learn. This country was built by waves of settlers, refugees, and displaced families arriving from a dozen different origins, and every single wave brought its own version of shame, its own version of silence. Unlike countries with one dominant founding story, Canada's surname history is layered. French colonists, Scottish exiles, Acadian refugees, prairie immigrants, and Indigenous families whose names were often altered or erased entirely by government officials who couldn't be bothered to record them correctly. A surname here isn't just a name passed down. It's a record of which ship you came on, which war you were running from, or which side of a dispute your ancestors landed on once they got here. That's exactly why certain names in certain regions still make people go quiet at the dinner table. Not because of what the name means, because of what it survived. And in some cases, because of what it was forced to survive without anyone ever writing the full story down. Here are the 17 surnames that carried more than a name ever should. Surname number 17. Bélanger. Bélanger traces back to early French settlers along the St. Lawrence, and in several parish records from the 1700s, the name appears attached to families accused of trading with English merchants during periods when that was considered outright betrayal of the colony. Whether the accusations were true or exaggerated by rival families, the label stuck for generations. Neighboring households reportedly refused to attend Bélanger weddings and funerals for nearly 2 decades after the accusations first surfaced, treating the family as though the suspicion itself was contagious. Descendants who moved west during the fur trade era often quietly changed the spelling, hoping a new region wouldn't remember what the old one refused to forget. Some records even show siblings from the same household adopting 2 different spellings within a single generation, each hoping their branch would be the one that got a clean start. If your surname is Bélanger, somewhere in your bloodline, someone chose a new spelling just to escape what the old one meant. Surname number 16, Fraser. Fraser arrived in Canada through Scottish Highland families forced off their land during the clearances, and the ones who settled in the Maritimes carried a reputation that followed them across the ocean. Back home, certain Fraser clans had been marked as informants during Highland uprisings, and that suspicion crossed the Atlantic with them, whether it was earned or not. Ship records from the period show entire Fraser households traveling under altered first names, a detail historians believe was meant to blur exactly which branch of the clan they belonged to once they reached new soil. Local lore in parts of Nova Scotia claims one Fraser family was shunned by neighboring settlers for nearly 40 years over a debt that was never actually confirmed. Letters passed down through at least one Fraser household describe relatives instructing their children never to bring up the old country at gatherings, not because of what happened, but because of what people assumed had happened. Whether or not the debt was real, the Frasers believed the silence around it enough to avoid the topic entirely for 3 generations. Surname number 15. Whitfield. Whitfield sits at an uncomfortable crossroads in Canadian history, tied to families who arrived as United Empire Loyalists fleeing the American Revolution. Choosing the crown over independence made these families instant outsiders in the eyes of neighboring communities who saw the split coming from miles away. Property records from Upper Canada show Whitfield land grants clustered suspiciously close together, which local historians believe was a deliberate attempt by the family to stay within reach of each other in case they needed to flee again on short notice. Some Whitfield households deliberately blurred their own arrival story, telling neighbors one version of why they'd come north and telling family behind closed doors another, a private account that in some branches wasn't shared with outsiders for nearly 100 years. If you're a Whitfield, there's a real chance the reason your family says they moved to Canada isn't the reason your ancestors actually lived through. Surname number 14. Doucette. Everyone in Acadian communities knows this name, but almost none of today's Doucettes are aware of what the name endured before it reached them. The family is tied directly to the Great Expulsion, when thousands of Acadians were forcibly removed from their homes and scattered across the continent by British forces. Entire Doucette households were split across different ships during the deportation, with siblings sent to different colonies who, in some documented cases, never saw each other again for the rest of their lives. Doucette families were disproportionately recorded in ship manifests during the deportation, meaning for every Doucette who eventually rebuilt a life elsewhere, there were dozens whose journey ended somewhere nobody back home ever heard from again. Descendants who resettled in the Maritimes generations later often had no way of knowing which distant cousins might still exist in Louisiana or along the Gulf Coast, a gap in the family record that some Doucette households are still trying to piece together today. We're almost halfway through this list, and if you've made it this far, I need you to do 2 things right now. First, comment the number of the surname that hit closest to home because I genuinely go through and read what you all share, and some of your family stories are wilder than the ones I'm telling you. Second, if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the next surname on this list is the one tied to a scandal that still shows up in provincial history textbooks, and you need to see where it came from. Let's keep going. Surname number 13. Riel. This is the one. If you've ever studied Canadian history and heard the name attached to a rebellion, the story traces straight back to this surname. The legend surrounds Louis Riel, a Métis leader in the late 1800s who led resistance movements against the Canadian government's expansion into the West. As the story goes, he was tried for treason and executed. And to this day, historians argue about whether he was a traitor or a founder of a nation that never got the chance to exist on its own terms. Relatives who shared the surname in the decades immediately following his execution reportedly faced open hostility in some prairie communities, with several branches of the extended family quietly relocating east just to avoid the weight the name carried out west. The Riel family carried the weight of that story for over a century, whether they wanted the attention or not. Only in recent decades has public opinion shifted enough that some descendants feel comfortable speaking the name openly in the very communities that once treated it as a liability. If your surname is Riel, You come from a name that became shorthand for an entire unresolved chapter of Canadian identity. Surname number 12, Kowalski. Kowalski comes from Polish immigrant families who arrived in waves during the early 1900s, many settling in prairie communities to work land nobody else wanted, often the driest and least productive plots left over. Once earlier settlers had already claimed the better ground. Some branches of Kowalski families were accused by neighboring settlers of siding with rival land claims during disputes over homestead boundaries, disputes that, in a few documented cases, ended up in front of local land commissions for years without resolution. Whether or not it was true, the accusation stuck to the name itself, following certain Kowalski households from one township to the next, as families relocated in search of a fresh start. Families with this surname were sometimes excluded from community events for years over a decision made by an ancestor nobody living had ever actually met. A grudge some prairie towns kept alive far longer than anyone could explain. Surname number 11, Baldwin. If you carry this name, you're connected to one of the most tense political bloodlines in Canadian history. The Baldwins were central figures in the fight for responsible government in the 1800s, and one branch of the family became entangled in a scandal involving a land grant that most historians agree was never fully explained. Almost overnight, a family respected for political reform became a family whispered about for private gain, with rival newspapers of the era publishing competing versions of exactly who benefited and who paid the price. Canadian records from the period suggest the land itself remained disputed for decades, tied up in court while the original Baldwin descendants scattered to avoid the attention, some changing careers entirely just to distance themselves from the family name in political circles. Some call it a footnote. The families who lived near that land called it something else, and in at least one township, locals reportedly refused to sell property to anyone carrying the Baldwin name for almost half a century afterward. Surname number 10, Baudouin. The Baudouins settled parts of rural Quebec for generations as one of the more quietly influential families in local church politics until a dispute with the parish priest in the 1800s stripped the family of nearly all its standing in the community. Parish records from the era hint that the disagreement began over control of a local building project and escalated until Baudouin family members were quietly excluded from church leadership roles they had held for 2 generations. What makes this surname different is what happened next. Rather than leave the region, displaced Baudouin families spread across neighboring parishes and eventually across the country, rebuilding their standing from scratch in towns where nobody knew what had happened back home. And to this day, it remains one of the more common French-Canadian surnames on record. Every Baudouin alive today descends from a family that refused to disappear quietly, even after losing almost everything they'd built. Surname number 9, Van Horn. The Van Horns were tied to some of the most consequential railway expansion decisions in Canadian history, commanding influence over land deals that reshaped entire provinces almost overnight. Towns that were promised a station, and the prosperity that came with it, sometimes found themselves bypassed entirely once the final routes were quietly finalized behind closed doors. When one major rail contract collapsed under allegations of favoritism, family legend says the details of who profited and who was left with worthless land were buried in records that conveniently went missing. Records that some historians still search archives for to this day. Whether or not the full story will ever surface, it became something the family passed down like an inheritance itself, proof that even in the middle of controversy, they kept one secret nobody outside the family ever fully uncovered. Surname number 8, Tanguay. This one is darker than most people realize. Tanguay comes from early Quebec settler records where the name was associated with families forced into indentured servitude arrangements just to afford passage across the Atlantic. It wasn't originally a mark of pride. It was a description used for families who arrived with nothing and had to work off debts for years before they were considered free settlers, often under contracts that bound entire households to a single landowner regardless of how conditions changed once they arrived. Some Tanguay descendants only learned generations later, through surviving parish ledgers, that their ancestors had technically been considered property of a contract rather than free colonists during those first years. If your surname is Tanguay, somewhere far back in your bloodline, a family crossed an ocean owing more than they owned. Surname number 7. Mackenzie. Here's the twist almost no Mackenzie family knows. While the name is associated closely with Scottish Highland heritage, in Canada it became tied to a very different legacy through Alexander Mackenzie, the explorer whose expeditions across the Western Territories were financed through arrangements with fur trade companies accused of exploiting Indigenous trading partners for decades. Company ledgers from that period describe pricing systems that left trading partners with a fraction of what furs were actually worth on the open market, a practice that generated enormous profit for the companies backing Mackenzie's expeditions. Over the generations, Mackenzie became so common across the country that most families carrying it today have no idea their surname is quietly connected to some of the most difficult chapters of the fur trade era. If you're a Mackenzie, your name has been carrying that history for over 200 years, whether your family ever discussed it or not. Surname number 6, Chartrand. The Chartrands were among the founding families of several early Quebec settlements before a dispute over seigneurial land rights fractured the family into rival branches, meaning this surname is quite literally connected to one of the earliest land ownership conflicts in the country's colonial history. Court documents from the period show the dispute centered on a boundary marker that was reportedly moved more than once, each side accusing the other of the same act of deception. When the dispute reached the courts in the 1700s, family tradition holds that one branch never spoke to the other again, a silence that lasted so long that cousins meeting generations later had no idea they shared a surname at all until a chance encounter at a regional fair brought the two branches face to face. If you carry this name, you come from a family that watched their own bloodline split over land that neither side ever fully kept. We've only got a handful of names left, and I promise you, the ones coming up are the heaviest on this list. If you're still here, comment the word buried below so I know you made it this far, and go ahead and subscribe now if you haven't. Because after this video, I'm ranking every province in Canada by how heavy its surname history actually is, and you don't want to miss where your family's province lands. Surname number 5, Comeau. Comeau comes from Acadian roots, and during the era of forced deportations, families with this surname were disproportionately linked to secret return voyages, families who were expelled but risked everything to sail back to the Maritimes decades later rather than stay scattered across foreign colonies. Local accounts describe small groups of Comeau families arriving quietly by fishing boat under false names, settling in remote coastal inlets specifically chosen because no official record keeper ever visited them. Family stories passed down in Comeau households describe ancestors who hid their return from local authorities for years, terrified of being discovered and removed a second time, sometimes going as far as burying documents that could prove their original identity. If your name is Comeau, there's a real chance your family's presence in Canada today only exists because someone, generations ago, refused to accept exile as permanent. Surname number 4, Thibodeau. The Thibodauds descend directly from some of the earliest Acadian settlers in the Maritimes, but early bloodlines come with early betrayals attached. Family legend holds that a Thibodeau ancestor's decision to cooperate with British officials during a land survey fractured the settlement apart, leaving the family divided into branches that, in some parts of New Brunswick, still won't fully claim kinship with each other today. Older residents in a handful of communities describe two Thibodeau family plots in the same cemetery, separated by an unusually wide gap, a detail locals say was intentional and never once questioned out loud by either side. This is the surname that split a whole town in half. Growing up, certain relatives were simply never discussed at family gatherings. Nobody explained why. You just learned not to ask. If your surname is Thibodeau, there's a decent chance there's a branch of your own family that nobody talks about either. Surname number 3, Boucher. Boucher is one of the more common surnames in Quebec, but common doesn't mean simple. Multiple unrelated Boucher families existed across different regions, and during the seigneurial land reforms of the 1850s, Boucher families were recorded among the most frequently displaced from their original land grants in the entire province. Government surveyors at the time reportedly favored newer arrivals with political connections, leaving longtime Boucher landholders with the least fertile plots once the reforms were finalized. Entire communities of Bouchers were relocated to poorer farmland further north, in a resettlement that became known bitterly among older generations as being sent to the edge of nowhere. If your surname is Boucher, your family likely survived one of the larger forced relocations in Quebec's colonial history, and rebuilt from almost nothing on the other side of it. Surname number 2, Cardinal. This is the name most of you have been asking about in the comments, so let's actually do it justice. Cardinal is deeply tied to Métis and First Nations communities across the prairies, carried by families who navigated some of the most difficult periods of forced relocation and residential policy in Canadian history. But the meaning isn't why this name carries weight. The history behind it is. One of the major branches of this surname traces directly to community leaders who resisted government relocation orders in the early 1900s, refusing to abandon traditional territory even as pressure mounted from every direction, including threats of losing access to supplies and support that other families depended on to survive the winter. Records from the period describe entire cardinal families choosing to remain on disputed land rather than accept relocation, facing consequences that rippled through the family for decades afterward, including being deliberately left off certain government registries that determined access to services other families received without question. To this day, the name is still spoken in some communities as shorthand for quiet, stubborn resistance, invoked by elders when describing what it actually costs to hold your ground. So if you're a cardinal, here's the real answer to what you asked for. You carry a name tied to one of the most difficult and important chapters in the country's history, a chapter still being reckoned with today. Surname number 1, Gauthier. We saved this one for last on purpose. Gauthier comes from early French settler records, and the Gauthier families of the Ottawa Valley became known as one of the last groups to actively resist logging company land seizures in the early 1900s, holding on to disputed timber rights for generations after most surrounding families had already sold out. Company records from that era describe repeated attempts to buy out Gauthier land at a fraction of its value, offers that were refused so consistently the company eventually stopped sending representatives to that particular stretch of the valley altogether. Because of this, the surname Gauthier was, for a period, treated with open suspicion by regional land authorities, a name flagged and associated with stubborn defiance for decades, and quietly excluded from certain regional business dealings as a result. If you carry this name, you descend from one of the very last families in that region who refused to give up their land, long after almost everyone else already had. So, 17 surnames and 17 stories your family may have buried on purpose. Some of these families crossed an entire ocean and started over with nothing. Some got split apart by disputes over land that doesn't even belong to anyone in the family anymore. And some carried a silence for so many generations that nobody left alive can explain exactly why the silence started in the first place. If you heard your own name somewhere on this list, I want you to do 3 things before you leave this video. Comment your surname and which story surprised you the most. Hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of content we cover every single week. And if this video hit home, share it with the one family member who actually still knows the old stories. Because half of you are about to learn something they've never told you. I'll see you in the next one.